Hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 712, Interview with Russ Baker. This program is being recorded on May 30th of the year 2010. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Russ Baker, the author of Family Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Russ Baker, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you very much.
In this remarkable book, you have, as I said before, taken what most people like to do, what most critics like to demean as conspiracy theory, unquote, and really illustrated what would be much more credibly and recognizably characterized as networking. And we're going to talk about networking with sort of the ultimate event that gets labeled as, quote, conspiracy theory, unquote, and that is the assassination of President Kennedy. Why don't we start with an article that appeared in The Nation magazine, in which, by the way, figured in a miscellaneous archive show when George Bush was running for president back in 1988. Article from The Nation magazine referring to a George Bush of the CIA and doings vis-a-vis the Cuban exile community.
Basically what happened was, and by the way, the background is that in doing 5 years of research for Family of Secrets, I happened upon the odd fact that George H.W. Bush could not remember where he was on November 22, 1963, the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And of course, no journalist worth his salt could possibly write a book about the family without at least exploring a fascinating question like that. And so I began trying to understand why he couldn't remember or why he wouldn't write about that event. And one of the things I ran across was the document to which you're referring. Basically, back in 1988, when George H.W. Bush was about to receive the Republican nomination for President of the United States, The Nation published an article by a gentleman named Joseph McBride who had come across this declassified memo. It was an FBI memo, and basically this memo said that on November 23, the day after the assassination, the FBI had provided a briefing to representatives of two other intelligence agencies, naming the agencies and the individuals, one of them being Mr. George Bush of the CIA. Now this was very, very interesting because, of course, Mr. Bush had been director of the CIA in 1976, but had made a point of the fact that he had no prior background or experience in intelligence prior to being named the director. That made little sense, and as I pointed out on another program, in fact, I discovered that there was a back history of involvement with the CIA by Bush Sr. Going back decades. And so that was the background when I looked at this particular document. And basically what it suggested was that he was somehow involved with Cuban exiles, who of course are a part of the important equation surrounding the death of Kennedy. And when Bush was pressed to explain whether that was him or not, at first he denied it. The CIA declined to comment. They said, we don't talk about personnel. They then broke their rule, and they then claimed that this was another George Bush. And as I detail in Family of Secrets, the other George Bush, very curiously, was hired by the CIA. He didn't have any kind of background in intelligence. He was hired at a low level, basically an entry-level position on a temporary basis shortly before the assassination, was kept on there for several months, and then was let go. And that was very interesting to me, that the only time that we know of that there might have been two George Bushes in the CIA were right at that moment. And, of course, that was very convenient when Bush was about to become president of the United States. The CIA broke their rules and announced that it was another George Bush. That in itself, by the way, people from the agency told me that was so strange. That meant that they were under tremendous pressure to make that claim. And so the significance there is that the other man then said it was not him, that he was merely a trainee, that he wasn't given any kind of briefings, and would not have been privy to this information. So we believe that the preponderance of evidence is that this was, in fact, George H.W. Bush, who was being named in this memo related to Cuban exiles and to the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination.
In our last interview, Russ Baker, you talked about one of the many things that you develop in Family of Secrets, which is the curious nature of poppy bushes. We should distinguish the two Georges. The poppy bushes, Zapata Offshore Petroleum, how it didn't make a lot of sense as a petroleum or business venture, but it made a heck of a lot of sense as an intelligence front, or what is known in intelligence circles as commercial cover. Develop that for us, and how does that relate to Cuba?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, you have to, when you look at Cuba, it's important to discover that many of these wealthy families had huge investments there. The Bushes and the Walkers, that's the maternal side of the family, both had extensive investments in plantations in Cuba. And so they all had a stake in Castro not nationalizing their properties. They had a stake in getting rid of Castro after he did so. And so that's the background. And then you have Zapata Offshore, as I say, a company whose numbers made no sense. It didn't look to be a company. It was getting tremendous amounts of money coming in from very well-connected figures in Washington, including the publisher of the Washington Post, for this little tiny company based in Texas. It didn't even have particularly good prospects. And H.W. or Poppy Bush was traveling all over the world on business that seemed to have nothing to do with the size of the business itself or of its activities with offshore. And one of the things I focused on in Family of Secrets is how Zapata put this rig on an island owned by Howard Hughes, who had extensive connections, as many wealthy people did, with the intelligence apparatus, that he provided this location. They put a rig there. They employed Cuban exiles to work on the rig. And then the rig was commissioned supposedly by a couple of major oil companies, one of which Gulf had on its board Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt, having just left the CIA, where he had been in charge of the coup in Iran against the democratically elected leader Mohammad Mossadegh, whose principal crime had been, again, involved with nationalization of resources. And so that's the background there. There's the rig. It's right off of Cuba prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was clearly some sort of an operational location. And actually, in Family of Secrets, I cite correspondence between Neil Mallon, who was Poppy Bush's sort of godfather, you might say, favorite uncle, Neil Mallon and Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, talking about our quote-unquote Caribbean project and how they were working together. Other correspondence where Mallon talks about how their company was being used to help recruit officers for the CIA. So you don't have to do a lot of connecting dots to see that the overwhelming indication is that this whole thing was a CIA operation, that Poppy Bush was deeply involved in it, that he was deeply involved and interested in the project to remove Fidel Castro. And then that, again, that's the background as we now move forward, and we're in 1963, and John F. Kennedy was involved with secret back-channel negotiations with Fidel Castro. He had fallen afoul of the CIA, of the Pentagon, of the oil companies, really of all of these power centers. And that was a very, very tricky act. And so it is with that background that we see Poppy Bush seemingly operational on something involving the Kennedy assassination and involving these intelligence agencies.
You made an allusion to Henry Neil Mallon. We talked about him in our first installment, our first interview, number 711, and in Family of Secrets, as we've already touched on, you discussed Dresser Industries, his role with Dresser Industries, and how that was one of the entry points for Poppy Bush into the petroleum business. Dallas, Texas, of course, and we're going to be, in a sense, navigating from Wall Street down to Elm Street, the street on which President Kennedy was killed. Dallas, of course, is inextricably linked with the oil business. Tell us about Henry Neil Mallon and the World Affairs Council of Dallas.
Right. Mallon was a member of this circle around the Bushes who'd been in the secret society Skull and Bones at Yale and who very much cooperated together in these clandestine operations after they got out of school. And so he was hired by the Bush family's investment bank, Brown Brothers Harriman, to run a company called Dresser Industries, which provided various services in the petroleum industry. And so he ran Dresser. Dresser, as I pointed out, cooperated with the CIA in, at minimum, helping recruit people to work for the agency abroad. It gave Poppy Bush one of his early jobs before he started his own oil company. Seemed to be very clearly an intelligence-connected firm, as many of these firms in the oil industry were, because you have to understand that they had a like mind and they had purposes in common. Mallon was particularly an enthusiast of this and was sort of a kind of an understudy of Poppy Bush's father, Prescott Bush. And so that's really what was going on there. This was he then moved to Dallas. That's really the original Dallas connection. And in Family of Secrets, because this is so complex, listeners can go and read the full blow-by-blow account of all this. But basically, Mallon moved to Dallas. Dallas was becoming the center of the oil industry, center of oil finance, and a key hub of the growing military-industrial complex. There were a tremendous number of defense contractors locating there. And so this was very, very important to this circle around the Bushes' banking interests and the aborning modern intelligence state. And so Mallon set up there, moved Dresser Industries to Dallas, and this became a hub, and it becomes a hub of all of these relationships that we then see directly to figures connected to the shooting of Kennedy on November 22.
Throughout Family of Secrets, Russ Baker, you detail the inextricable relationship between the petroleum industry and the intelligence community, and you present a remarkable portrait of someone who, in many ways, I think, could be considered an historical microcosm of the 20th century and perhaps even a certain part of the 21st century, though he didn't live nearly long enough to see the 21st century, and that is George de Mohrenschildt, nay, George von Mohrenschildt. And given that we could probably spend a whole hour on de Mohrenschildt alone, I wonder if you would detail his background, starting with Tsarist Russia, the Nobel oil fields, and this world of Cold War activities, espionage, petroleum, and after sort of an introduction, and the de Mohrenschildt family as a whole, talking about some of the deep networking. I was fascinated to see de Mohrenschildt. I knew that he knew the Bouviers, but I didn't realize that before World War II he was networking with the Bouviers, the family of Jackie Kennedy, and with the Bush milieu. George de Mohrenschildt, nay, George von Mohrenschildt.
Right. Well, the background there, again, in the context to Family of Secrets, which is a book principally about the Bush family, the context is that that Lee Harvey Oswald, in the year prior to the assassination, that there was one individual who was particularly influential in his life, in and out of his apartments constantly, driving him to appointments with dentists, arranging babysitting, lodging when they needed a new lodging, and so forth. And this was very interesting. This is not well known. This is not. It's referenced briefly in some books, but there's been a wholesale failure to scrutinize this man who essentially was an influencer over Oswald. Because if Oswald was involved in the shooting of Kennedy, or even if he was not, just the mere fact that he is the central figure of interest there, you need to look at the people who seem to be orchestrating him, and the principal orchestrator was this George de Mohrenschildt. And so I began, the reason I looked at George de Mohrenschildt was because at some point it became clear to me that George de Mohrenschildt not only knew Lee Harvey Oswald very well, but he also knew George H.W. Bush. And in Family of Secrets, I provide actual documentation, correspondence between them, and so forth. And I explain the backstory. And basically, again, this takes a whole chapter in the book, so I can only just sketch the barest outline. But George de Mohrenschildt was a Russian emigre from a privileged family essentially in the nobility. And they had been involved with the oil industry in Azerbaijan, in Baku, which was at the time the greatest single source of petroleum in the world. and all of these great families, including the Rockefellers, were all trying to get in there to get their piece of the action. And so de Mohrenschildt was supremely well connected. When he came to the United States, he was quickly plugged into certain families, including, as you pointed out, the Bouviers, Jackie Kennedy's family, and they would actually spend time with them on Long Island, out near what is now the Hamptons. But interestingly enough, George de Mohrenschildt also had a direct connection to George H.W. Bush. So what I'm saying is Lee Harvey Oswald's, so essentially his handler, if you will, was close with Bush 41 President George H.W. Bush. And that relationship went back to prep school, where when George H.W. or Poppy Bush was a young man, he lived in a little house with another fellow, and that fellow's basically mother was married into George de Mohrenschildt's family, and George de Mohrenschildt for a time lived in their apartment, I believe it was on Park Avenue. And so you have this fascinating connection, and many, many years later, there's a letter from George de Mohrenschildt to Mr. Bush when he's CIA director, asking him for help because he's afraid for his life. We can talk about that later. But the interesting thing about the letter is that they talk about how they know each other, and they make clear that, in fact, this relationship did exist. And that's very significant. What's also interesting is that Bush, in a memo in the CIA files, says, I knew de Mohrenschildt years ago. He had some sort of connection with Oswald. I can't remember what it was.
This, of course, from an individual who became director of the CIA, who was certainly in Dallas, certainly the night before, maybe even on November 22nd, 1963. But like Richard Nixon, who also was in Dallas on 11/22/63, we seem to have trouble remembering just where he was. Of course, for younger listeners, we should probably fill this in, Russ Baker. For younger listeners who hopefully will read Family of Secrets and learn some of the past that has determined their future, for younger listeners, it is generally said that people who were of the age of consciousness all remember where they were and what they were doing on November 22nd, 1963. That does not apparently include George H.W. Bush or Richard Milhous Nixon, who both became President of the United States in subsequent years. George de Mohrenschildt, I believe it was his brother or his cousin Dmitri. They were deeply involved not just with the oil industry and not just networking with the Bouviers and Bushes before World War II, but deeply involved with intelligence matters and anti-communist matters right from the immediate aftermath of World War I. Develop that for us, if you would, Russ Baker.
Well, I mean, this family, you have to understand that this was very common, that wealthy families throughout the world, and even to this day, if you go to Latin America or what have you, they're very close with the intelligence apparatus because they have the most at stake. They need information. Information is power. That's the way it works on Wall Street, too. If you have the inside information, if you know where the resources are, you can get them. You can get there before somebody else. If you have the information on the people who own the land, you have something over them. You have a way of coercing them. This was a key part of getting wealth and maintaining wealth, was information. And so intelligence agencies provided information, but moreover, when they began, for example, the CIA began with the covert operations aspect, which was actually proactively going in and backing or orchestrating coups against the leaders that were threatening American interests. When I say American interests, I'm talking mostly about private corporate interests. And so in that sense, the de Mohrenschildts were very, very typical. Dmitri, his brother, was involved with the CIA, again, in Family of Secrets. I have some of the correspondence there. He was involved. The CIA was creating these teams of sort of Russian exiles who would be involved with propaganda behind the Iron Curtain. So that's the background to this family. Of course, we could go on, and it could continue to sprawl in all directions. But the key point here, I think, for anyone listening and interested, is that what I'm doing in Family of Secrets is I am explaining the back history of what is going on right now in America and in the world and what will be going on in the future. And it is a narrative that is entirely missing from the conventional media. And so when you hear about this oil blowout in the Gulf, the worst environmental catastrophe ever of that kind, there's no context, there's no understanding that Halliburton, one of the companies involved with the operation there, was merged with Dresser Industries, the same company that the Bushes were involved with, that a lot of these companies were in a particular building in Dallas where it seems like almost every entity in that building, as I describe in Family of Secrets, had CIA connections. George de Mohrenschildt had his own little company with an office there. Lee Harvey Oswald was brought to that building to try to secure a job for him. And so things like this, these obscure kind of complicated things that went on 40, 60, 80 years ago, this is the preamble, if you will, to what is going on today. It's a continuation, and it's a whole alternative history that we are not being taught.
George de Mohrenschildt also briefly worked for, or maybe not so briefly, he also worked for Pantepak Oil, the oil company of another former CIA officer, the late William F. Buckley. And they were not disinterested vis-a-vis matters Cuban.
Well, you see, this is another interesting thing. A lot of people say, oh, William F. Buckley, great intellectual, the editor of an important conservative magazine. He died not long ago, but people may remember seeing him on shows like Charlie Rose. But they don't know the background of William F. Buckley. They don't know that his father was in the oil business and was involved around the turn of the 20th century down in Mexico trying to get control of the oil down there. And then all of these people being on each other's boards. The Bushes and the Buckleys were very closely connected in making money and in exerting influence, and that's the backstory to these editorials you would read from William F. Buckley praising George H.W. Bush as a candidate for president and so on. There was no contact, no understanding that there were back relationships there between all of these people.
And you also write that Pantepak Oil House had appeared to have won many of the concessions that would have given them access to Cuban oil had Fidel Castro not acceded to power. One of the things that is so remarkable about the apparent shepherding around of Lee Harvey Oswald, the 8th grade educated Marxist Marine who defected to the Soviet Union because of his Marxist sympathies, then came home and then was adopted not only by George de Mohrenschildt, but was being shepherded around in the white Russian community in Dallas-Fort Worth, developed that community for us. People like George Bowie, people like Paul Regorodsky and others. A remarkable group of people for an 8th grade educated, ostensible Marxist Marine to be associated.
I think these are too many names for people to handle. This is just my take on this, so I'm going to speak more generally.
Sure.
You're very knowledgeable on these things, but I'm going to just broaden this a little bit. Basically, there is a backstory I was talking about earlier to Dallas, and even people in Dallas don't know this, and that is that there was apparently a deliberate effort to create Dallas as a kind of a super national security city, and all these people were being funneled there. So defense contracts were being sent there. There were whole vast tract of land where all of these big defense factories were. The Republican Party of the South had its origins in Dallas at a time where the South was almost entirely Democratic. You had many of these Russian emigres, staunch anti-communists, brought on a kind of an underground railroad out of the Soviet Union and eventually brought to Dallas, where they then were introduced to and intermarried with some of the wealthiest American families there, including, for example, the daughter of the head of the Dallas Federal Reserve. And so what they were doing was they were weaving in these two strains, two elite strains, the Russian old money and the Texas new money, and creating a common cause between them. This is very interesting stuff that I've never seen in any books before. I discovered all of this in the course of the 5 years I spent researching Family of Secrets, and I know from many people I've spoken to that they found this extremely interesting, that there would be this backstory to one of our most important cities, and how this was being constructed as a kind of a fortress town, if you will.
On side 2, and we're down to just about the last 5 minutes of this side, in side 2 I want to talk about some of the apparent operational elements involving, again, the petroleum industry and the intelligence community and people like Jack Alston Crichton, but more of this networking in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the White Russians. Jean Legon, or if I'm pronouncing that correctly, later Jean de Mohrenschildt, tell us about some of her connections, including to Abraham Zapruder, who filmed the JFK assassination.
Right. I mean, again, my experience on talking about these things is that I quickly overwhelm people if I hit them with too many names. So I'm going to speak more generally and say that what we see in Dallas is that all these people knew each other. And we see that, for example, the man who filmed that famous movie, what you're talking about, the Zapruder film, that shows Kennedy being hit by the bullets, that he knew the woman who would become the wife of Lee Harvey Oswald's handler. That's a very, very close relationship here. That all of these people were members of the same elite anti-communist councils there. They would actually sit and meet and talk about what was happening in the world. These people, almost to a person, were alarmed by John F. Kennedy and by what he was doing. And in Family of Secrets, I have one chapter devoted principally to this whole story of what was John F. Kennedy doing. It turns out, and this surprised me, it was not something I had realized before, was that Kennedy in many ways was much more radical than he is portrayed in the mainstream media and in conventional academia, and that he was really very, very concerned about things like the risk that he would preside over the destruction of large parts of the country in some sort of a nuclear Holocaust, and so he didn't want that to happen. Was very, very involved with back-channel negotiations with the Soviet leadership to the consternation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and many of these other interests. And so you see all of these people, like this wife of Jean, the wife of de Mohrenschildt, Zapruder, the man who filmed the Kennedy assassination. And by the way, then his film was taken out of public sight for years, controlled by Time Life Publications. Henry Luce, the head of it, a close friend, again, of the Bush family, a member of Skull and Bones. And so when you were talking earlier about how people poo-poo anything like this as conspiracy theory, it's basically kind of ignorance and laziness. And in fact, if you didn't find all of these facts, and that there are so many of them, indisputable facts of any kind of interest at all, you'd have to be guilty of, you might say, coincidence theory.
Mm-hmm.
Which would be that everything is a coincidence and nothing means anything. Now, when we look at our own lives, we look at patterns. And, you know, when somebody is worried about their child, the child repeatedly doesn't come home on time, tells stories that don't seem to be true, they want to know, they want to get to the bottom of it. Why our country would not, as a society, want to get to the bottom of all of these fascinating, indisputable facts is beyond me. I think it's a kind of a collective sort of terror at the notion that there is a bigger story there, and that our democracy is not and has never been anywhere as robust as we like to convince ourselves that it is.
Centuries ago, Dr. Johnson observed that it can be truly said that treason doth never succeed, for when it doth succeed, none dare call it treason. Russ Baker, tell us about Family of Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years, the website, and where people can obtain it. And we're going to talk more about this networking, not conspiracy theory, but networking in Sadu. Tell us about your website and how people can get the book.
Family of Secrets. We have a website, familyofsecrets.com. You can go there and click and order it through the links. You can also go to your local bookstore. Hopefully they have it. If they don't, tell them about it. They can order it. You can get it in the chains. You can get it online, Amazon and so forth. And we also have a nonprofit investigative reporting site called whowhatwhy.com, whowhatwhy.com, where we continue these sorts of deep explorations into our current history.
If it seems like we've been drinking from a fire hose, rest assured that there is so much more just in the subject of Dallas that we have not touched on, and we're going to touch on some of it in Side 2. However, this concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 712, interview with Russ Baker. This has been recorded on May 30th of 2010. For Russ Baker, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emery, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 712, Interview with Russ Baker. This has been recorded on May 30th of the year 2010. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Russ Baker, the author of the formidable tome Family of Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. A history, Russ Baker, which you've done a lot to help bring into view. Welcome back to our airwaves.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
And if I get a little bit out of line in terms of too much detail, please feel free to sort of discipline me, because that's a useful function here. Anyway, back to the events of Dallas, Texas, and George H.W. Bush. There is a milieu which not only involves the intelligence community, but the oil industry. And one of the people you talk about is Jack Alston Crichton, an individual with more connections than a switchboard and who figures prominently in this. And I wonder if you would fill in how he fits into this concatenation.
Right. One of the things I do in Family of Secrets is I devote 4, or perhaps you could even say 5 chapters of a history of the Bush family to the Kennedy assassination, beginning with the odd point that George H.W. Bush, we'll call him Poppy Bush, the father, the first President Bush, could not recall where he was on November 22, 1963, the day that Kennedy was shot. So fascinated by that, I began digging, and I dug and dug and dug, and I almost dug my way to China. It just blew my mind what I discovered. And one of these things was all of these networks of connections. For example, George H.W. Bush, Poppy Bush, at the time of the Kennedy assassination, when he can't remember where he was a candidate for the U.S. Senate on the Republican side. The candidate for governor on the Republican side was this man named Jack Crichton. And I kept noticing that Bush and Crichton had connections, and I was fascinated by that. And so in the book, Family of Secrets, I go into some detail about that. But in a nutshell, Mr. Crichton appeared to be some sort of a military intelligence officer assigned to the oil industry. And he was very well connected into all of these different circles. For example, he ran this secretive military intelligence unit. This doesn't seem to be in practically any books on the Kennedy assassination. If it's in there, there's only a brief mention. I go into it quite a bit more. That Crichton is running this military intelligence unit. More than, I believe it was 60 or 70 members of the Dallas Police Department at the time of the assassination were also members of this secret military intelligence unit. Now, you would think that that would have been of interest in the examination of the assassination and whether there was any kind of an organized operation or not. Jack Crichton also was basically a kind of a running mate of Mr. Bush. Years later, you see this oral history where Crichton talks about how Bush invited him to come to the White House and play tennis with him. Crichton did a bunch of other things. One of his guys was in the pilot car of Kennedy's motorcade. This car controlled the pace of the motorcade. These guys were not originally supposed to be in that car. They basically forced their way in. There were several of them, and they were members of this military intelligence unit. Also, one of them was doubled as a deputy police chief, a fellow named Lumpkin. So that's Crichton was connected to all of those guys. I also discovered that he had created an underground communications bunker underneath a museum. And this bunker was operating on that day. Now, that in itself, you could probably write a whole book about. What was an underground communications bunker doing on the day of the Kennedy assassination, being run by a man from military intelligence whose colleagues were in the lead car of the motorcade? So that's Crichton. We also find him on the day of the assassination, after Oswald is being made to be the fall guy, I believe, for the assassination. They need corroboration of this, and so they need to get to Marina Oswald, to his wife, and get her to say something that will incriminate her husband. And so the Dallas Police Department sends a translator over there, but not until Jack Crichton tells them which translator to send over. And it is another Russian emigre named Ilya Mamontov, who works for an oil company, again tied in with the same intelligence interests. And he basically twists her words in order to make her husband appear to have been a likely figure in assassinating the president. So that's Jack Crichton again. Crichton appears again and again and again in Family of Secrets, in intelligence-related connections, in connections that appear to involve or relate to Mr. Bush and to what happened that day. And altogether, they suggest some kind of a coordinated effort on November 22.
You've mentioned a couple of times that the former CIA director, George H.W. Bush, could not remember where he was and what he was doing, at least if we're to take him at face value, on November 22nd, 1963. You detail where he appears to have been and what he appears to have been doing. I wonder if you'd tell us more about that.
Sure. Now, are you referring to the Parrott memo?
Well, I'd like to get that. That's how he covered his rear end at the end. But
you
really,
want to do that later. All right.
Yeah.
Sure.
What I was really thinking about was the address. I think it was he was talking to a drilling association. He was also talking to a Kiwanis club. And Joe, who was Mr. Zeppo, as it was written about in a letter by Barbara Bush.
Very, very complicated. But again, just trying to simplify, I beseech folks to go to Family of Secrets and take their time and read. And by the way, some people, when they read books, they just skip around. Don't do it with Family of Secrets. It's very, very carefully constructed from page one forward, laying out, introducing characters and relationships. And if you skip around, you have no idea what's going on. But basically, some years later, another declassified memo came to light, and this one showed that George H.W. Bush, on November 22, 1963, the same person who could not recall where he was, and the same person who, in another memo, is characterized as secretly working as a Central Intelligence Agency officer with Cuban exiles at the time of the assassination. In this other memo, he is presented as a private citizen, an oilman, who is in a town about 40 miles from Dallas, and he's calling the FBI as it is being announced that the president has died, and he's saying, I may have some information on who shot the president. Now, this is significant because the memo, when it came to light, the more I studied, the more I concluded the only thing I could think of that memo served, because the information in it was not correct, was that he was putting on the record that he was in this other town. And then I studied the maps, and I figured out how far that was from Dallas, and it was pretty clear that he had come from Dallas, and we don't know exactly what time he came from Dallas, but through other documents I lay out in Family of Secrets, we know that he was in Dallas the night before at a Oil Contractors Association meeting, and then the next afternoon, the afternoon after the shooting, he was in this town of Tyler, Texas. And so it seems likely, or it seems essential, that he traveled from Dallas to Tyler. And then the only question was, would he have traveled late at night after speaking at a convention of his friends, where presumably they were having a good time and enjoying themselves at cocktail hour and so forth? Or, and since we don't know what he did the next morning, or did he arrive in Tyler shortly before that phone call of 1:45 p.m. on November 22, and the likely conclusion is that he arrived by this private plane sometime shortly prior to 1:45 p.m. on November 22. Now, that plane that you refer to was that of a man who had one of the largest offshore drilling companies, and a man named Zeppa, a very interesting fellow in his own right, who had connections back to Wall Street interests and major banks, who had set up this company that also seems to have possibly provided operational assistance in intelligence activities. And so there he was giving a ride to Mr. Bush from Dallas to a town nearby, at which point he then calls and says, hi, I'm calling from this town, and I'm trying to be helpful with a possible lead in the assassination of the president. Now, all of this is very interesting on its own, but it's even more interesting when you consider that this is a man who really, as far as the public was concerned, didn't want anybody to even know where he was at all that day.
Yeah, and what's interesting too, by the way, for veteran listeners, in For the Record 449, and all of my programs are basically 3+ decades are archived on SpitfireList.com. In FTR 449, we talk about where the elder George Bush was officially, and he was in the plane of a Mr., according to Barbara Bush, a Mr. Zep O. Couldn't even remember the name. I wondered who that was because I'd never heard the name, and I'm pretty familiar with the Dallas nomenclature from that time period. And you point out that it was actually Zeppa, Z-E-P-P-A, not Z-E-P-P-O.
Well, right. The reason for that is very important. You see, none of these things are accidents. In spycraft, in tradecraft, there's a lot of deception that goes on, of course, because it's all secret. And so you have to have cover for everything. And so in Family of Secrets, I lay out in great detail a role of Barbara Bush, very interestingly, in providing a kind of a deception. She published, shortly after they left the White House in the 1990s, she published her memoirs where she suddenly remembered for her husband, who claimed he'd not to remember where he was on November 22, a letter that she claimed she had been writing on November 22. And it's a letter she's writing in a beauty parlor in Tyler, Texas. And she describes how while she's writing the letter, she hears over the radio that the president has been shot. And she says, oh, my gosh, that's terrible, and so forth. And then she says, now we've left Tyler, and we're on the plane of Mr. Zeppo, who's been kind enough to give us a ride to Dallas. Well, the letter itself that she purports to have written back in 1963, as I point out in Family of Secrets, there's no indication that letter actually ever existed in 1963. It doesn't make any sense that it did. But what purpose it serves in that book is that now that all these other documents are coming out and people have reason to look at her husband's activities that day, she is basically doing some sleight of hand, sort of magician trick, directing you in the wrong direction. She is getting you to think that they got on the plane of this man and they flew to Dallas that day, rather than they were already on that man's plane flying from Dallas that day. And she then makes it impossible to figure out who that man was by misspelling his last name. Now, I assume that the former First Lady of the United States, having a rather extensive staff, a major publisher, fact checkers and lawyers and so on, would know well enough then to misspell a surname. So, but I struggled because I couldn't find a Zeppo. I looked. The only Zeppo was Zeppo Marx, one of the Marx brothers. And so I kept looking, and eventually I discovered someone named Zeppa. Now, we don't have the time here to go into all the detail, but in Family of Secrets, I explain who Mr. Zeppa is and why I think she may have deliberately misspelled it as Zeppo, because it creates deniability. She can say, look, we're not hiding anything. We were saying that we were on this man's plane. We're not hiding the fact that we flew from Tyler to Dallas. But what they are hiding is what the man's name was and that they had first flown on his plane from Dallas to Tyler. And that's, of course, more important because the question is, what time did Mr. Zeppa's plane with George and Barbara Bush on board leave Dallas on November 22, 1963? And where was Mr. Bush before he got on the plane? And what was he doing?
Barbara Bush also wrote about another one of her friends while she was sitting there having her hair done as President Kennedy was getting his hair done in a very different way. Tell us about Doris, a.k.a. Doris Ulmer, husband, or wife, rather, of Al Ulmer.
Right. In that letter, which she publishes in her book, and by the way, the strange thing about this letter is it's excerpts from a letter. Now, usually when you do memoirs, the letters that you choose to publish are ones that are understandable to the reader. In other words, the stuff that readers would be interested in would be perhaps her reaction to hearing that the president had been shot and so on. But you wouldn't normally include personal portions of a letter where you're saying, oh, by the way, I had lunch with our former neighbor so-and-so, because that's not interesting to the reader. And any good editor would have excised those things unless the Bushes insisted that they be left in the book. Now, that's very important because, again, she mentions someone. She says Doris Ulmer. And she says it was so good. This week we had lunch with the Ulmers, and she only uses the name Doris Ulmer. She doesn't say what her husband's name is. But she says in there her husband had been, you may remember them, her husband had been so good to Daddy, to Poppy, not to Daddy, to George, to Poppy Bush, when he was in Greece. And, of course, I wondered, well, when was he in Greece prior to 1963, and I looked, and there was no indication of him having been there until I found certain documents. And of course, I discovered, going through Ulmer, eventually I discovered that Al Ulmer was CIA. Now, this is, of course, back in the 1950s. They would have met in Greece when George H.W. Bush supposedly had nothing to do with the CIA. But there he was, apparently being treated very, very well by Alfred Ulmer, a key CIA operative in various parts of the world, very involved, very interestingly, with coups. He was involved with removing foreign leaders that the United States, or rather the CIA and its sponsors, did not like. He was involved with efforts to try to remove the nationalist leader, Sukarno, in Indonesia. And so here, some years later, we see that the Bushes are hanging out in Texas around the time of the Kennedy assassination with Al Ulmer, who I discovered didn't even live in the United States. He had been living abroad since he and his boss, Allen Dulles, were forced out of the CIA by John F. Kennedy. And so it's very interesting that Al Ulmer should choose the week of Kennedy's assassination, he being an expert in the removal of heads of state, that he should choose that week to visit Texas and to have lunch with the Bushes. It's also very interesting how Barbara Bush, again, both provides a lead, but then she obscures the lead so that nobody can find it. But if anybody does find it, she can say, well, obviously I wasn't hiding anything. I can't help it. I misspelled this person's name, and that I didn't say who Doris Ulmer was married to. Do you understand? This is a very, very sophisticated covert and propaganda effort.
You made an allusion to Allen Dulles, who, of course, was fired by President Kennedy for lying to him about the Bay of Pigs, and then served on the Warren Commission, ostensibly investigating Kennedy's assassination. Allen Dulles, you, of course, have been involved in promoting your book, Family of Secrets, Russ Baker. Allen Dulles published a book in 1963, and you point out some highly unusual features of his promotional endeavors.
Well, that's right. I was fascinated because there was evidence that Allen Dulles he'd been removed from the CIA. He was a very close friend of Prescott Bush, the father of Poppy Bush, or grandfather of George W. Bush. And I quote in Family of Secrets a letter in which Prescott Bush expresses tremendous anger and bitterness at the Kennedy family, in part because they basically removed his good friend Allen Dulles from the CIA. So this obviously was something of an obsession for the Bush family, and this helps contextualize the "where was George" aspect of this. And Dulles, so where was Dulles? And we discover that he requested a list of CIA officers and former CIA officers in Texas, and that in the year prior to the assassination, he publishes this book, which is no great shakes, and he does a book tour, but all I can find for the book tour is Washington, D.C., and Dallas, and he's in Dallas ostensibly for his book tour, just a few weeks before the assassination, which is very interesting to me. It's also interesting to me that his book is written with E. Howard Hunt. E. Howard Hunt being, of course, a CIA coup specialist in Guatemala, where they got rid of President Arbenz, who was threatening the interests, again, of wealthy American families and corporate interests in that country. So you start to see a pattern here. These guys, Ulmer and Dulles and Hunt and so forth, all on first-name basis, very close with the Bush family, all involved with the CIA, all involved with overthrowing leaders who have angered powerful corporate interests in the United States. And that really, I think, is the larger theme in Family of Secrets, which is that the United States government at those levels is not operating on our behalf, is not carrying out the policies that they try to sell to the voters, but instead is serving the interests of this very small clique of powerful and wealthy people.
Yes, and of course, E. Howard Hunt will come back into our narrative in connection with Watergate. Who was the mayor of Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963?
Cabell, and Cabell, C-A-B-E-L-L. Very interesting story about him. His brother was the deputy director of the CIA, also removed at the same time as Allen Dulles. And so there's another interesting connection there. These connections are so powerful. This web, if you drew a chart and you connected all these people. Now, it is true that some powerful people tend to know each other, but this is operating on a completely different level. And I've talked to statisticians and people involved with probability, and they say that at this level of connection and of interest, not just connection, but of interest, of agenda, as stated in their own diaries, in their own letters, and so on, you have a very, very powerful coming together of individuals and agendas.
Simply from an actuarial standpoint, it's extraordinarily unlikely, if not downright impossible, that all of these people would happen to come together in just this particular place at just this particular time in coordination with one another. Very quickly, one of the details you point out about Allen Dulles' book tour is that apparently that Dallas appearance in October of '63 was about the only time he departed from the Mid-Atlantic states in the Washington, D.C. area in that book promotion tour. One more name I'd like to fill in for the listeners, Russ Baker, in Family, and then we're going to get to the Parrott memo, so to speak. In Family of Secrets, you write about who owned the Texas School Book Depository from which Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly fired the shot that killed President Kennedy, and once again, this is a very interesting and well-connected individual.
That fascinated me, and I kind of got into the whole thing of Oswald backwards, because again, I was just simply trying to understand how, why Poppy Bush's memory failed him in relation to the day Kennedy was shot. This, of course, then took me to the relationship with George de Mohrenschildt, we talked about on the other program, who was essentially tantamount to a handler for Lee Harvey Oswald, steering him to his ultimate fate. George de Mohrenschildt himself having ties directly to the Bush family. And so I continued to sort of examine these things, and I looked at certain things about Oswald. I was less interested in focusing on the things that so many of these other books do, which is the ballistic evidence and so on, all of which I think can be easily cooked, to situational matters. So, for example, Oswald could not have been considered to be the suspect in the assassination had he not been working in this building, the so-called Texas School Book Depository, that day. So I began to wonder, how did he get his job in this building? And that led me then to ask, what was this building? What was this Texas School Book Depository? Well, what I discovered, Dave, much to my amazement, was that, again, this is an area that had not been properly plumbed, even though there are, I'm going to guess, more than 1,000 books out on the JFK assassination. People have not looked at this. What was the Texas School Book Depository? This was not the name of the building. This was the name of a company. It was a company called the Texas School Book Depository Company. It was a company that wholesaled textbooks to schools. And the building that they moved into, called the McPherson Building, was largely empty until shortly before the assassination. Again, this fact is missing from most accounts. The building itself was owned by D. Harold Byrd, a powerful right-wing oil man who was, again, directly connected to George de Mohrenschildt, the man who was Lee Harvey Oswald's handler. I document that in Family of Secrets. He also was a founder of a paramilitary group called the Civil Air Patrol in Louisiana, which was where Lee Harvey Oswald got his first introduction into those circles, and that led him in turn into the Marines and then into some of these other things. So very interesting. Now, the Texas School Book Depository Company, I discovered, was run by a man also connected with military intelligence and with the American Legion itself, a kind of a paramilitary civilian organization devoted to very right-wing views and to the military. And this man moved part of his company into that building a few months before the assassination. He kept his other facility, very interestingly. He didn't seem to even need this office, but he moved it in there. And at a time when they didn't even need any employees because it was the fall and they'd already shipped all their textbooks, they hire Lee Harvey Oswald and they keep him on. And they seem to be doing that as a favor to somebody. And that was very interesting to me as I evolved toward the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald was some kind of an operative, but that he was not aware of the role he was going to be playing in this thing when he was told by George de Mohrenschildt or whoever that at this point you need to take a job in this building. He had no idea what was going to unfold. But these other people seem to have known what was going on.
Yeah, and you point out, too, that ultimately Byrd was the beneficiary of defense contracts. He hated Kennedy, and he had the window from which Oswald allegedly fired at Kennedy removed from the building and ultimately reassembled at his own home. So
yes, Byrd was a hunting enthusiast. He loved the idea of using rifles to bag rare big game, and he would actually go and look for highly prized rams and other wildlife and kill them. And it was very interesting that he then makes it possible for this military-connected company to move into the building to put this Oswald in, and he takes off. And so even though he knows that the president's going to be in town, a president who he despised, he takes off for his first ever foreign safari, and he happens to be in Africa at the time of the shooting. And so, of course, when the Warren Commission convenes, they don't bother to interview him because, well, hey, he wasn't even around that day. So quite interesting. But then afterwards, he has the window from which Oswald allegedly shot. And by the way, I don't think he shot out of that window. But that window, that iconic window, removed and put into his house as some sort of a bizarre trophy.
Basically, the window of opportunity, so to speak. It was in front of that building that Chief Lumpkin, a member of Jack Alston Crichton's military intelligence unit, stopped and spoke to one of his policemen. We got about 3+ minutes, maybe 4 minutes left. You talk about a very interesting memo. By the way, George Bush, by the way of George H.W. Bush, covering his behind in this, the Parrott memo, and how do you see that as relevant to the situation?
Almost impossible to get into that. I have a whole chapter in Family of Secrets just on the Parrott memo. I'll try this very fast. There is the phone call from Tyler, Texas, where Bush says he'd like to be helpful, and he offers a tip. He identifies a man named James Milton Parrott. He says, I don't know much about this man, but I think he may have been talking about shooting the president. And so this establishes the reason for this phone call to the FBI, which gives a reason for him to be listed in their confidential records as being in Tyler, Texas, that is, anywhere other than Dallas, shortly after the assassination. The Parrott memo itself, if you study it, and I did in Family of Secrets, it looks to be a red herring, a classic trail that leads nowhere. It turns out he knew Mr. Parrott quite well. He seems to have had a good sense that this man was incapable of an unlikely, improbable to be somebody who would have wanted to kill the president or could have done that. He actually knew Mr. Parrott much better than he let on. And as we discover, Bush's own assistant was going to Mr. Parrott's home precisely at the time Mr. Bush was calling the CIA, calling the FBI, while he was saying Parrott may be a threat. His own assistant was showing up at the man's house, asking him to do some work for Mr. Bush and providing him with what would ultimately be an alibi so that neither of these guys would get in trouble.
And again, you have a whole chapter on that. Listeners may be holding their heads, their eyes may be rolling at this point. They may be completely overwhelmed with information. Suffice it to say, under the circumstances, that we have only been skimming the surface. I have been encapsulating things. If listeners have had their interest whetted, and I sure hope they have, then what they should do is go out and buy the book. Family of Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. The author is Russ Baker. And in this electoral season, people always ask me, well, Dave, I believe what you're saying, but what can I do about it? Something they can do about it is to buy the book. In our last 20 seconds, Russ, tell us about the websites and how they can do that.
FamilyofSecrets.com and Family of Secrets. You should be able to get it in your local bookstores. If they don't have it, ask them to order it and carry it. Order it online, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, what have you. We have another site, whowhatwhy.com. This is to do ongoing, continuing investigative reporting about current events.
The author is Russ Baker. The book is Family of Secrets, and this concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 712. This has been recorded on May 30th of the year 2010. My name is Dave Emery for Russ Baker. Thanks for listening.
Including the publisher of the Washington Post, for this little tiny company based in Texas. It didn't even have particularly good prospects. And H.W. or Poppy Bush was traveling all over the world, a business that seemed to have nothing to do with the size of the business itself or of its activities with offshore. And one of the things I focused on in Family of Secrets is how Zapata put this rig on an island owned by Howard Hughes, who had extensive connections as many wealthy people did, with the intelligence apparatus, that he provided this location. They put a rig there. They employed Cuban exiles to work on the rig. And then the rig was commissioned supposedly by a couple of major oil companies, one of which Gulf had on its board Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt, having just left the CIA, where he had been in charge of the coup in Iran against the democratically elected leader Mohammad Mossadegh, whose principal crime had been, again, involved with nationalization of resources. And so that's the background there. There's the rig. It's right off of Cuba prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was clearly some sort of an operational location. And actually, in Family of Secrets, I cite correspondence between Neil Mallon, who was Poppy Bush's sort of godfather, you might say, given any kind of briefings, and would not have been privy to this information. So we believe that the preponderance of evidence is that this was, in fact, George H.W. Bush, who was being named in this memo related to Cuban exiles and to the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination.
In our last interview, Russ Baker, you talked about one of the many things that you develop in Family of Secrets, which is the curious nature of Poppy Bush's, we should distinguish the two Georges, the Poppy Bush's Zapata Offshore Petroleum, how it didn't make a lot of sense as a petroleum or business venture, but it made a heck of a lot of sense as an intelligence front, or what is known in intelligence circles as commercial cover. Develop that for us, and how does that relate to Cuba?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, you have to, when you look at Cuba, it's important to discover that many of these wealthy families had huge investments there. The Bushes and the Walkers, that's the maternal side of the family, both had extensive investments in plantations in Cuba. And so they all had a stake in Castro not nationalizing their properties. They had a stake in getting rid of Castro after he did so. And so that's the background. And then you have Zapata Offshore, as I say, a company whose numbers made no sense. It didn't look to be a company. It was getting tremendous amounts of money coming in from very well-connected figures in Washington. In fact, I discovered that there was a back history of involvement with the CIA by Bush Sr. Going back decades. And so that was the background when I looked at this particular document. And basically what it suggested was that he was somehow involved with Cuban exiles, who of course are a part of the important equation surrounding the death of Kennedy. And when Bush was pressed to explain whether that was him or not, at first he denied it. The CIA declined to comment. They said, we don't talk about personnel. They then broke their rule, and they then claimed that this was another George Bush. And as I detail in Family of Secrets, the other George Bush, very curiously, was hired by the CIA. He didn't have any kind of background in intelligence. He was hired at a low-level, basically an entry-level position on a temporary basis shortly before the assassination, was kept on there for several months, and then was let go. And that was very interesting to me, that the only time that we know of that there might have been two George Bushes in the CIA were right at that moment. And, of course, that was very convenient when Bush was about to become president of the United States. The CIA broke their rules and announced that it was another George Bush. That in itself, by the way, people from the agency told me that was so strange. That meant that they were under tremendous pressure to make that claim. And so the significance there is that the other man then said it was not him, that he was merely a trainee, that he wasn't.
Hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 712, Interview with Russ Baker. This program has been recorded on May 30th of the year 2010. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Russ Baker, the author of Family Secrets, subtitled The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Russ Baker, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you very much.
In this remarkable book, you have, as I said before, taken what most people like to, what most critics like to demean as conspiracy theory, unquote, and really illustrated what would be much more credibly and recognizably characterized as networking. And we're going to talk about networking with sort of the ultimate event that gets labeled as, quote, conspiracy theory, unquote, and that is the assassination of President Kennedy. Why don't we start with an article that appeared in The Nation magazine, in which, by the way, figured in a miscellaneous archive show when George Bush was running for president back in 1988. Article from The Nation magazine referring to a George Bush of the CIA and doings vis-a-vis the Cuban exile community.
Basically what happened was, and by the way, the background is that in doing 5 years of research for Family of Secrets, I happened upon the odd fact that George H.W. Bush could not remember where he was on November 22, 1963, the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And of course, no journalist worth his salt could possibly write a book about the family without at least exploring a fascinating question like that. And so I began trying to understand why he couldn't remember or why he wouldn't write about that event. And one of the things I ran across was the document to which you're referring. Basically, back in 1988, when George H.W. Bush was about to receive the Republican nomination for President of the United States, The Nation published an article by a gentleman named Joseph McBride who had come across this declassified memo. It was an FBI memo, and basically this memo said that on November 23, the day after the assassination, the FBI had provided a briefing to representatives of two other intelligence agencies, naming the agencies and the individuals, one of them being Mr. George Bush of the CIA. Now this was very, very interesting because, of course, Mr. Bush had been director of the CIA in 1976, but had made a point of the fact that he had no prior background or experience in intelligence prior to being named the director. That made little sense, and as I pointed out on another program, in